You are listening to the Marc Guzman Podcast Experience. Okay, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Ask Marc Anything. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be a traditional Ask Marc Anything. In fact, we're going to get into rent control, a little bit of Prop 10, and some briefing studies that came about from the Haas Institute regarding rent control and their support for rent control. They also quoted a displacement brief by the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. And I really want to address this today because, and Sam's going to chip in with a few additional questions and comments, but Prop 10 is going to be on the ballot here in a few weeks in California. And Prop 10, what it does is if it passes, it will repeal the Costa Hawkins Act that was enacted in, actually passed in 1995. What Costa Hawkins does is it protects single-family homes and condos from being placed under rent control in city jurisdictions that have rent control. So, for example, if you own a single-family house in Berkeley, California, your single-family home is exempt from rent control because of Costa Hawkins. If Costa Hawkins gets repealed, essentially if Prop 10 passes, City of Berkeley is already prepared to expand rent control on single-family homes and condos. Now, another component of Costa Hawkins is that there's actually two components, and we'll get into why they're very important. One component is vacancy decontrol. Costa Hawkins says if you have a rent control...
We need to restart. The video isn't recording.
Are we still live, though?
Yeah. All right, yeah, now we're recording on video. So.
Okay. So going back to vacancy decontrol with Costa Hawkins, if you have a rent control unit, let's say the unit is worth $2,000 a month, and you have a 5-unit apartment building. You have one unit that's renting for $1,000 a month, but it's worth $2,000 a month on the open market. When that tenant leaves, then you can then remarket that vacant unit at the $2,000. So that's vacancy decontrol. So it allows you to market a vacant unit at market rents. So that's another very important component of the Costa Hawkins Act. If Costa Hawkins gets repealed, what can potentially happen is the rent boards in various rent control cities can then expand control and essentially tell you what you can rent it for. So when that tenant at $1,000 a month leaves, the city may come in and say, you can only market this at maybe $1,100 or $1,200, even though market is at $2,000. Well, that's a huge problem because if your return is only going to be an extra $100 or $200 a month, how much money are you going to dump into the property to rehab it and get it ready for another renter? Most landlords are going to say, I'm not going to do anything, and I'm not going to do new paint. I'm not going to do new carpet or anything fancy. I'm just going to put it right back on the market because if someone was able to live in it without any habitability issues prior, why am I going to do anything different to upgrade it? I'm just going to put it right back on the market for $1,100. So what's going to happen is you're going to have substandard buildings over time, and it's just not good. People are not going to be incentivized to fix up the units, and guess what? People will rent out a bedroom or a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,100, $1,200 a month under rent control, and they'll snag it up even though they have to do work themselves. And you're going to see a lot of tenants essentially paying out of their own pocket to fix up rental units. Now, a third component of the Costa Hawkins Act is that new construction built after 1995 is exempt from rent control. So again, any new construction built after 1995 is exempt from rent control. So I'm going to jump right into the Haas Institute study that they did. And actually, this is a briefing. It's not even a study. So one of the things that really stood out to me, whenever you look at a study or hear about a new study or read a briefing paper, You want to look at various components. Number one, you want to look at who put it together. You want to look at their reputation. You want to look at if there's any political backing, money from some, like for example, if there's a briefing or a study done by Monsanto, you probably are going to find that that study favors that company, right? So, number one, you want to look at who's doing the study, where they get funding from, and how reputable they are. Number two, you want to look at the actual study. What are they trying to figure out in the study, and where are they getting the data from? And then finally, when you have the data, you want to look at whether it's correlation or causation, two completely different things. And one of the biggest problems in any political environment is when policies are being made off of correlations instead of causations. For example, I'll give you something interesting here. Did you know that, and these are examples of correlation, the higher the cheese consumption, right? Higher cheese consumption correlates with higher deaths by bed sheets. So death by bedsheet highly correlates and maps out exactly with higher consumption of cheese. Now, does that mean
then don't eat cheese in bed then?
right? Now, does that mean if you eat cheese in bed, you're going to die by your bed sheet? Absolutely not. But it's a correlation. It's not a causation. Here's another one. Miss America winner age, the age of Miss America winner correlates exactly on a graph with the death by steam vapor, water vapor. I mean, it's identical mapping on the actual graphs, but it's a correlation. It does not mean that steam will determine or predict the age of the Miss America winner. So
So like if steam kills 13 people in 1 year, that means Miss America will be like 28 years old.
so there's actually more deaths than 13 people by steam,
Oh my
but
God.
but yes, it's typically in the high teens and mid 20s. So you can see how this completely correlates. So there's a quote that says, "A nation that doesn't understand basic math statistics will be led by bad statistics." And it's really, really important that we understand when we're reading briefings or studies and hearing policy decisions by the government officials that we elect as a society. It's very important that we understand the difference between correlation and causation. The biggest flaw that I saw in this Haas Institute briefing, along with the supporting documentation, is everything was based on correlation. That's it. There's nothing in any of these studies. In fact, one of the studies did not even mention housing, but yet they quoted it. So, um, so let me get into it. So I don't even know where to start here because it's quite a bit of stuff. But
Why don't you just pick one of the pages where the study really gets into the why rent control is beneficial. We can just go page by page, kind of
yeah,
discussing various
yeah. Let me go
aspects.
a little bit into the history. This is going to be a little bit longer episode than I thought, but I think it's really important information for people to understand to make a good decision at the voting booth in November. So the idea behind rent control really started around I believe World War II, and I believe it disappeared. It came back in the 60s and 70s, and I believe the last one that was passed was 1980, and that might have been city of Berkeley, but then nothing happened until Richmond in 2016. So if you look at the states that have rent control, okay, there's only 3 states that have rent control. It's Maryland, New York, and California. All other states have said, I believe 35 states have already made it illegal. Rent control is illegal. Illegal policy. You cannot manipulate the market that way or restrict the market that way. Then 11 states have simply said, we don't believe in rent control. There's no law that says it's illegal, but we simply don't want rent control. So there's 3 states with rent control. New York has a ton of cities with rent control. California is little by little growing with rent control cities. But the idea of rent control really came about because the rental prices have gone up astronomically with housing boom and with everything that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years. And the affordability, the housing affordability marker continues to keep dropping. And so when you have homeowners that, or people that could buy homes that now cannot buy homes simply because they're being outpriced, they're being forced to become renters. They drive up the prices. Renters that are low income, very low income, even medium income are now having to pay more money toward rent because essentially people are outbidding each other for what's available on the housing market. Now, one of the big problems with that is you have a big influx of people moving into California. Now, I'm going to stick with California here because California's its own bubble from the entire United States economy. So you have a big chunk of people that are moving into California. Now, if you look at domestic migration, you actually have a negative domestic migration from California moving to other states. So you have Californians moving out of the state, but you have a lot of foreigners moving into California, and that's driving up the population here in California and the Bay Area. So you have high demand and housing supply. If you look at the number of new housing supply that's built every single year, it's been extremely low. We're supposed to be building about $180,000 units per year to keep up with the number of people moving into California. The problem is we've only been building around 50,000 units. And that's horrible. We are right now behind 2.02 million units behind. I mean, that's ridiculous. We need to build more housing. And so I'm actually glad to hear that both candidates for governor want to build and encourage new development housing. You have Newsom that I believe wants to push 500,000 units per year, which is very aggressive. Cox is pushing 300,000 units per year. I think that's still very aggressive, but both are needed. And it's just good to hear that both are on the same level of building more additional housing, because as inventory goes up and your demand is the same, you have prices drop overall. So everything comes down to supply and demand. So let's get into the report. One of the things that really stood out to me, and one of the arguments for rent control, is because prices have gone up too high and income has not kept up with pricing, it's becoming harder and harder for families to afford rent. And that's a reason for rent control. Now, there's a very popular chart that many economists, many organizations use to look at the adjusted gross household income. And if you look at the adjusted gross household income for the last 20 years, and I'll get hyper-local here in the Bay Area, nothing has changed for about 20 years. There's been a little bit of an increase, a dip, and another increase, but nothing has really changed. The problem is this is adjusted gross income, and there are flaws when you're measuring and running policies based on adjusted gross income, because there's a lot of factors that can go into adjusting the gross income. So that's a whole nother mathematical video. Go onto YouTube, Google problems or issues with adjusted gross income. You'll get a little crash course on why it's not really a good measurement. It's a measurement, but not the best measurement for household income. The measurement that you really want to look for, and Christopher Thornburg with Beacon Economics did a great presentation, and he's got great visual graphs that you can follow along, where he explains the difference between adjusted gross income and disposable income. So what you want to look at is household disposable income. Now, the difference with disposable income is, what does a household have, like total in income, that they can then spend on housing, cars, financial, restaurants, dining. So their total disposable income, that then they can choose how they want to spend it. And if you look at that indicator, you start seeing that income for households have been going up for the last 20 years. And in fact, the average household income right now in the Bay Area is $110,000. So when you see things in studies and reports where they say, well, the average salary or the average job cannot afford the average rent. Yeah, that's true, but that's also not realistic when it comes to a household. The actual household will have 2 or 3 working adults, sometimes even more working adults, depending on the size of the actual house, whether it's a 2, 3, 4 bedroom house. So you have to look at those different factors. And the reality is, and there's the data out there, you can look it up. The disposable income per household in the Bay Area is now at 110,000, which has been going up every year since 1997. So that's the number one thing that popped out to me that was flawed in this, is that they're using the adjusted gross income, which again, there's many ways to modify. It's not really a good indicator of a household income, because you really want to look at disposable. What does a household have in entirety, 100%? What can they spend this 100% cash on? And housing, automobile, everything else. Another thing that we hear all the time is rent control restricts housing. It restricts housing supply. And you can see this because rent control encourages people to stay inside of their unit because their rent's not going to go up, or it's going to go up 2 or 3% per year. It's not a big deal. So it encourages people to stay in their housing. By encouraging people to stay in properties and not letting the market do what the market naturally does, you're encouraging people to stay in, reducing the amount of inventory that would normally be on the open market. When you have a shortage of inventory and the same demand or even higher demand, you have prices that go up. It's very simple. Now, many proponents of rent control state that rent control does not create a lack of housing production. And here's a quote from the actual Haas Institute briefing here. The 3 largest Bay Area cities with rent control, San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland, have only 27% of the region's housing, but according to the U.S. Census Bureau, those cities have built 43% of the Bay Area's new multifamily rental units in buildings with 5 or more units since 2000. They are using this, what I just read you, they are using this as a core reason for why rent control doesn't affect housing production. But I can tell you the reason why this is the case. It's because of the Costa Hawkins Act. So if Prop 10 passes and repeals the Costa Hawkins Act, this disappears. Their entire argument here is essentially because of Costa Hawkins. So what Costa Hawkins does is it prevents rent control for anything built after 1995. So if you're building anything after the year 2000, as the report states, guess what? Those apartment buildings do not fall under rent control. Because they don't fall under rent control, yeah, investors are encouraged to build, and they've got no problem building because of Costa Hawkins. If Prop 10 passes and Costa Hawkins disappears, there's no incentive for developers to continue building in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. They just go build next door to the next city. That alone right there, this entire report was, to me, in my personal opinion, completely put together. I don't know. It's a very, how many pages is it, Sam?
It was like 36 pages. It was
36.
Half of it is about detailing the effects that high rents have on people, which, most of that I agree with, because I think, the gist of it was, if you pay high rent, you're not happy.
Yeah.
Which I think we can all agree on that.
So I do want to address the high rent and how that affects people, because that's in their next briefing report that they had a link to.
Well, one stat that caught my eye there was that if everyone was paying rents they could afford, that Californians would have an extra $24 billion a year, like overall, not each person. An extra $24 billion a year that they could reinvest in the economy, and also the belief is that with more affordable housing, you can reduce the number of homeless in California to which California invests $5 billion a year throughout the whole state in taking care of the homeless problem.
So the homeless problem, there's part of it. Yes, it's due to housing affordability, because if people can't afford to stay in a place and they can't afford or can't move anywhere and they end up homeless, that is a problem. But do you know that to solve the entire homeless problem in the entire United States will cost approximately $20 billion to provide all these people with shelters and get them into institutions that can help them? Because many homeless people are also suffer from mental health disorders. So $20 billion, and we can fix the homeless situation in the United States. And $20 billion is the same cost that Americans spend in 1 year on Christmas light decorations. I mean, if we really wanted to solve the homeless problem, we could do that if we got up in arms and told our politicians to just pass something that costs 20, 30, 40 billion dollars and fix a homeless problem and get them the help that they need and the shelter that they need. So, I mean, the homeless problem has been aggravated because of housing affordability, but it is something that can be solved on the side. And that's something that there's a lot of people that don't want that, because for whatever reason, they don't want their taxpayer money to go help needy people, right? And, I think as a society, we should get something passed to help out the homeless people, because if you look at the cost of everything, I mean, it's very cheap. Why don't we skip on Christmas lights for 1 year and then get all that money to pull together, fix a homeless problem? I mean, we could do it. So, but yeah, the cost of rents are really high, but that 24 billion that could go back into the economy. I mean, think about this. I haven't done the actual math on that, but I would be willing to take a gamble that it would end up being a wash, because going into this briefing report that they also linked up, and this is a displacement briefing report by the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. One of the causes that they state for displacement of people from the Bay Area moving out is due to neighborhood conditions. Now, it was a little bit vague, but then they go a little bit more in detail as to why neighborhood conditions will cause displacement, and that essentially comes down to lack of public funding or improvements in older neighborhoods or in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. And so that's their main reason why. But if you think about it, the higher the rents that are being paid, the more the buildings are worth, right? Where the property owner then has to pay more in property taxes. When they sell the property, it's worth more, so there's property transfer taxes that they have to pay. In cities like Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley, owners also have to pay a sales tax on the rent that's collected. They're usually paying, I want to say it's like 2.5%, 1.5%. It depends on the building size, but you're paying a couple percent in sales tax of your actual income, plus property taxes, plus real estate transfer taxes. All these different taxes, including taxes to pay the rent board fees for their services, all these taxes go back into the public works system, which go to help out to fix these neighborhood conditions. Now, if they're not being used to fix a neighborhood condition, then that becomes an issue that we need to take up with the cities and the managers and, mismanagement of funds, which we've seen across the board in many cities. But again, that's a whole nother issue. I mean, yeah, I mean, so I think if that $24 billion number, if you look at the amount of tax revenue that would be lost because of that, I think you're going to find out it's going to be a significant wash. And I mean, many landlords, when they get that extra money, what do you think happens? I mean, it goes right back into the economy many times. You have a lot of landlords that are individual owners. They only own 1 or 2 properties at the most. They're spending that money right back into the economy just as much as renters are. So, I mean, now, don't get me wrong too. I understand rents are high, everyone does not like paying high rents. And I've said this before on the podcast several times that I think if they came up with a modification for rent control, it would be much more beneficial than the way they are passing rent control right now. For example, if you had rent control where every 5 years the price would be reset to market value, I think you would have a lot of landlords and a lot of people on board with that. That's a great compromise. It's not a permanent rent control for life for many landlords, so they'll be happy. And it also provides a long enough 5 years, long enough term for the tenant to know that, okay, one day their rent is going to jump up to market. I mean, you can even do it 10 years if you wanted to. Maybe a 5 year small jump and a 10 year it goes to market, something to that effect. But it's got to be meeting somewhere in the middle. Because you have two sides that are just fighting extremes. So I think somewhere in the middle would be ideal. Now, one of the other problems with rent control is that there's no guarantee that it goes to benefit low income and very low income families and households. So that's one other problem, and a very big criticism of rent control, even by the San Francisco Chronicle, right? When they came out with their article about a month ago, where they were against rent control and the expansion of it simply because there's no way to guarantee it goes to help out the people that really need it. So here in this displacement briefing, they talk about the need of rent control to help out the poor, elderly, and families that are low income and very low income. Well, the problem is when you enact rent control, whoever's living in those units get to benefit from it now. Meaning if poor, elderly, or families are not living in those rent control units at the time it passes, they don't benefit from it. And what ends up happening is you also end up with some people that make a lot of money, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year, that are living in a rent control unit that they won't move because they want to keep this unit for, a vacation spot, a hotel chain that they use for themselves, or they Airbnb it, and you have a lot of corruption that happens there, and a lot of people that do not need rent control, yet they have rent control. And that defeats the purpose of passing rent control to help out the people that are in need. If you want to help out the people that are in need, create policies that directly affect and benefit them, not something blanket across the board that also benefits a lot of the people that don't need it, because you end up hurting more people in the long run than helping out the people that need it in the short term. So
I guess that kind of plays into the whole moral argument that this report makes at various points. I write at one point saying, public has both a legal and moral right to make changes in law and regulation to ensure investors cannot take advantage of markets that fail to protect the public interest.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, is that kind of, the right move, trying to play like the moral argument that, we need rent control because it's the morally right thing to do. But at the same time, are you creating a problem, further down the line for the same people you're trying to help, I guess?
So I understand and totally agree with the idea that we as a society should help out the lower income people, and we should all have a certain quality of life. And I'm all for that. The problem is this does not guarantee that for anyone. Again, like, you could pass policies all day long. If they go to support someone in need, I'm all for it, and it would be a good policy. However, there's no guarantee that people in need will benefit from this. And there was actually a really good study that was done on New York, the state of New York, because New York has a lot of rent control cities, and they looked at rent control and rent stabilization, and it showed that tenants in non-rent control units, so tenants in non-controlled units, pay higher rents due to less supply and landlords jacking up the price to make up the difference of rent control units. So it does limit the amount of inventory that's on the market. Also, tenants in rent control units were willing to pay more at the initial lease start, understanding that future rent increases would be smaller. So this was a very interesting psychological thing. If you have two apartments, and I'll use two cities here in the Bay Area that are side by side. You have city of Richmond and city of San Pablo. If you have the city of San Pablo, let's say there's a 2-bedroom for rent, and then you have a 2-bedroom apartment for rent in Richmond. The one in Richmond is rent control. The one in San Pablo is not, because city of Richmond has rent control. You might be willing to pay more rent for the 2-bedroom in Richmond than the 2-bedroom in San Pablo, knowing that your rent increases in the Richmond property can only go up 2 or 3% per year, whereas the San Pablo one, there is no rent control, so you don't know how much it'll go up every year. So you're willing to pay a little bit more in Richmond to get that certainty, to get that stability over a long-term time. Again, that shows that prices, that will drive prices up. When you create when you create low inventory and a demand to get into certain rent control units because the future rent increases are going to be controlled, you drive up the prices. 2 bedrooms in Richmond were $1,500 in the middle of 2016. Now they're about $2,000. Maybe it's $2,100. So prices have gone up by 33-35% in the last 2 years, 2.5 years. It's I mean, if you look at the cities with the most expensive rents in the Bay Area, you have Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, and now Richmond. And these are all the cities with rent control. And so I think time and time again, rent control just shows it does not work, which is why many people are against it and why many cities and states have made it illegal. So that was something that was very interesting in the study, that they found that people were willing to pay more for rent control units, knowing that their future rents would be controlled. But the study also concluded that there was no guarantee to target the benefit, meaning the poor, elderly, and families were equally likely to be found in controlled units as uncontrolled units. However, the difference is in the uncontrolled units, they were paying higher rents than the controlled units. So at the end of the day, you still have the same percentage of people that you're trying to help in both controlled and uncontrolled units, yet the uncontrolled are now paying higher rents because of the presence of rent control. That's a horrible policy that's made simply based on correlation policies and not a direct cause and effect. And if Prop 10 passes, Costa Hawkins gets repealed, now you're going to have investors really moving away from building new apartment housing in San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and the other rent control cities, because they're not going to be protected anymore by Costa Hawkins Act. So I think we got into most of these reports. Oh, and actually, before we finish this off, I do want to get into going back to what I originally said about studies. When you see a study or hear of a study, you want to look into it and figure out what was really said. Is it correlation? Is there actually causation? A really good example is, I want to say 2 years ago, a study came out that said 1 glass of wine was the same as 1 hour at the gym, and that went viral all over the internet, all over news networks. So 1 glass of wine equals 1 hour at the gym. And the reason why, when you really looked into the study and found out how flawed the study was done, number one, on mice. Number two, the study was on the resveratrol component of red wine. Well, what the scientists did was they extracted resveratrol and they injected it into the actual mice. And they were able to see how resveratrol was able to function and actually make the mice fit. And it was really, I guess they were able to do more physical activity and just simply by taking this resveratrol. So they came out and said that 1 glass of wine is equal to like an hour at the gym. Now, it wasn't really the scientists that came out and said that, because when you looked at how much resveratrol they were pumping into the mice, that would be equivalent to a human being drinking $22,000 or 22,000 bottles of wine. I mean, you would die before you even reach that level.
Challenge accepted.
Right? Yeah, we should have had a glass of wine right here while we did this.
Yeah, some of our early workouts in.
Yeah. So going back to this displacement briefing, I made some notes here because usually at the end of certain sentences or claims, they'll have little footnote numbers that you can then go back to their footnotes and look at the citations. What you want to do is then further research these citations. It's a lot of work, but if you want the truth on a study to see if it's flawed or not, you have to do it. And this is the only way you can properly educate yourself on whether the actual briefing or study is legit or if it's falsehood. So they have several studies here. I went, looked it up. One of the studies did not even make a correlation between housing and the effects on children and families and displacement. So that completely took me off guard. Another citation was the Haas Institute citing the Haas Institute. Well, that's, again, that could be flawed unless the original study was done really well. Again, when you're doing briefing studies, I mean, you have to be very suspicious when people are quoting themselves. I mean, Sam, I give you an example. That'd be like Trump saying something and his reasoning behind it is because he claims he believes it. So how believable is that? That's up to you to decide. But let's see here. Conclusion. One of studies was done in 2008 in New Zealand with small groups of families. I mean,
it just doesn't seem like that really can apply to
rent control in Bay Area. Exactly. I mean, these are different areas. And in fact, the conclusion, it actually states, so when you look up these studies, there's always the abstract, which gives you a full briefing, and then you can go into the actual study. This concluded that it was a correlation for practitioners to use as a measurement in assessing children. Yet this is now being used to argue for rent control, which this has nothing to do with rent control and housing policies. But it's always nice and fancy when you have 6 numbers lined up at the end of your sentence that link up 6 different studies that 99.999% of the people will never, ever research and look up. So it makes your paper look really nice. One study. So in one study, they were talking about displacement in various cities and the reason why. They did the study based on 10 cities. Only one city was in the state of California. All other 9 cities were outside of California. And guess what? All other 9 cities were in areas that did not have rent control, and rent control was illegal in those states. So they're literally using a study that did not focus around housing, around rent control, to argue for rent control. Think about that. They're literally using statistics that you can make an argument for correlation. Again, it's not causation. The causes of the affordability issue that we have in California and across the nation is building supply, the inventory of properties. We need inventory to go up. If inventory goes up, everything gets solved. A law firm, and I've said this multiple times on the podcast, a law firm came out with a great study that if only 25% of all California single-family homes were allowed to build an accessory dwelling unit, also known as an in-law unit, studio in the back, a granny unit, whatever you want to call it, the housing market would be solved. Like the affordability would be solved, because then everyone in California would have a place to live. And that would be a very, very simple problem, or a simple solution to a really big problem. So again, it doesn't come down. The pricing is a result because of the lack of inventory. It's simple supply and demand. And I just hate seeing stuff like this that's put out that's completely distorted because they know people are not going to know better, or people are not going to research this information. So...
All right. So we're going to continue more of this tomorrow. We got Brian Benikid coming on. We're going to discuss this whole report and Prop 10 and further on this week's Highest and Best episode. And we'll be back tomorrow for more.
Perfect. So tune in for more. And one thing with Brian, I do want to get into how rent control affects property values. So look out for that. It should be a very good episode. So again, thank you for watching or listening on the podcast. Make sure to subscribe. Subscribe on my Facebook page. Hit that like button. Definitely subscribe so you get notified about every live video that we do or any video that we post up of one of our podcasts. Go to iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Go hit the subscribe. Give us a rating if you like to listen to the podcast. Please, please go to iTunes. Give us a rating. Let us know what you think about it. And thank you. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubman. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at markguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.